I'm Coggin from Crossroads, but I'm representing Celebrate Water Door County. And I welcome you to Door County Reads' first author talk of 2019. Now, when you read a good book, a really good book, one that makes you think, don't you just kind of end up with more questions than you started out with? Wouldn't you just love to talk to the author and get some of those answers? Today you have your opportunity. Many of you took cards when you came in and pencils. And if you have a question, write it down. Legibly would be good. And pass it to the side aisles. And librarians will come down the aisles and collect them. And they will give them to the moderator. Now, speaking of our moderator, I'm honored today to introduce Bret Bicoy. Now, in a word association game, to the name Bret Bicoy, the first word I would think of is, look at his face, give. And that's because Bret always wears this shirt that says Give Door County, which happens to be the tagline for the Door County Community Foundation. And Bret is the president and CEO of that foundation. Through his work with the foundation, the speeches he gives, articles he writes, focus groups he moderates, Bret has taught Door County the true meaning of philanthropy. He also graciously and generously gives up his time and his wisdom. When I have an idea, the first thing I do is make an appointment so I can run it by Bret. Is this just another harebrained scheme, or is this actually a worthwhile, and is it worthwhile? And he invariably gives me an honest answer. And I'm not alone. I know many, many people do the very same thing and take advantage of the wisdom of this giving man. Annie Egan has the distinction of being the first person in Door County to have read Death and Life. That's because she's Dan Egan's mother, and because she had agreed to proofread the manuscript. But like all of us who have now read the book, she realized that though she had spent her entire life living by the Great Lakes, she didn't really appreciate them. What could she do to raise awareness? Well, she did what we all do. She went to Bret. And fast forward, Celebrate Water Door County came to be, and she and Bret went and convinced the Door County libraries to join this countywide initiative, and here we all are. So, help me welcome today's moderator, Bret Bicoy. Now, because this is Door County Reads, I am assuming that you can read Dan Egan's biography in the program. So instead of reciting the long list of his accomplishments and awards, I'm going to tell you a little story. About 5 years ago, I was listening to Interlochen Public Radio. I was half listening to it and I was weeding. So the program came on and it was an interview about DNA testing of Asian carp. So I started halfway listening and then I stopped weeding so I could focus, because I realized that the guest expert really knew what he was talking about. It became very evident that he had done his research. And about halfway through his interview, he said something. There's more to worry about than just Asian carp. And at that moment, I knew I had to get this guy for a speaker at Crossroads. And the lecture would be called, There's More to Worry About Than Carp. So I could hardly wait to the wrap up so I could find out who the guest was. Well, it was Dan Egan. Dan Egan, I knew his parents. I depended on his articles for reference material. And in fact, he had already been in Crossroads. He was covering, the International Joint Commission of the Great Lakes, and you were doing a story on it? Yeah, on water levels. So he'd already been there. So I contacted him. And he was very nice, but he said he really didn't want to give a lecture. But maybe he would do a question and answer. But No, wait, that's not, this was 5 years ago, Dan. What he said was, he would be happy to come to Crossroads, but he was working on a book. So he couldn't come right away. But once he finished his book, he would have lots and lots of time. Right. Since the publication of Death and Life of the Great Lakes, Dan Egan has been in demand. He's been traveling all over the country, appearing on network television, accepting prestigious awards. Mostly, though, Dan Egan continues to be an investigative journalist, a profession for which I have the utmost respect. And he is a man who inspired Celebrate Door County. And I hope today he will celebrate each of you. I give you Dan Egan.
Thank you, Coggin. Boy, questions are already coming up here quickly. Before I have a chance to even look at my notes here. So, well, Dan, I can't tell you again how excited we are to have you join us. I would say that probably next to your mom, Annie Egan, we at the Community Foundation were probably among the second group of people to actually take a look at your book when it was still in the manuscript form. You see, one of the things that Dan did was he asked his mom if she'd be willing to read through it and edit it and offer some commentary through that process. And as you can imagine, a book of this size, when you try to print it out on a printer, it turns out to be a binder filled with information. So Annie had sent it to the Community Foundation to print out for her. So we were happy to do that and deliver it to her. So really, Dan, the first question I have for you is about your writing process. When you write a book, do you always ask your mommy to check your homework?
Yeah. She actually used to type my high school papers because I didn't know how to type. So I would longhand them and she would type them out. And I thought she was doing me a favor until I got to college. And she didn't come along.
Now you grew up in Green Bay, right, on the banks of the Fox River. I've been told that Cleveland's polluted Cuyahoga River had nothing on the Fox River back in the days when you were growing up. I'm curious, what was it like growing up next to the on the banks of the Fox River, you know, flowing into this great freshwater source, and then being told by your parents that you shouldn't go anywhere near the water?
Yeah, you know, it was a mess. I grew up in Alloway and went to school in De Pere, and we used to play down by what is now Voyager Park, and it's really pretty, and you can see all those fishermen, you know, the bass fishermen that are coming in. But back in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of action down there. It was just a mess. We used to pick out little nuggets of sulfur from the riverbank and light it. And, you know, I remember thinking, boy, this is nature's bounty. What cheap fireworks. No, but it was not considered, you know, a safe place to play, not just because of, you know, obvious drowning concerns, but because it was dirty. And, you know, if you went swimming in the river, which we would do, you know, we didn't tell our parents. And you know, it's an interesting phenomenon because when you're 10 or 11, 12 years old, and that's your river, that's all you know, and you kind of think, this is the way it's always been, and this is the way it's always going to be, and this is what we deserve, and, you know, it's not.
Well, you've been coming up here. I think both your sets of grandparents on both sides had cottages in the county. You know, that's a very different experience, I imagine, coming up here and seeing the lake. What, you know, how did your childhood spent coming to Door County influence your feelings about the Great Lakes?
Well, yeah, it definitely made an impression on me, particularly after I went to school, to college in Michigan, and then I moved out west in 1990, I think, and came back in 2002. And when I say out west, I was in Wyoming and Idaho and Utah, so I was basically in the desert. And came back here, and you look at the lakes completely differently. But yeah, you know, there was that dichotomy of the filthy Fox River in the lower Green Bay. I mean, it's tragic, I think. You look at a map, if you look at a globe, and you zero in on the peninsula and then Green Bay, and you think, if you love water, what a great place to be. But there are no beaches. When I was growing up, and I'm sure this is the case today as well, but there are no beaches in Green Bay for families or people to go to. I mean, there's University Park out by UWGB. You're not supposed to swim there. We would swim a little bit, but you'd have to get up, to Dykesville or so before you could find a public beach. And that's, I don't remember what my point was, but that's sad. And so it was nice to be able to come up, not too much farther, up to Egg Harbor and over to Bailey's Harbor, and to, have some great times and still have great memories of being able to recreate on water that wasn't dangerous.
I would say on behalf of Jack Moneypenny and the Door County Visitor Bureau, we're okay with the fact that they come up here to use our beaches, but we don't need to go there. So, I think I know a little bit about your background, and you've been a newspaper guy really more than anything else for much of your career. And I've even heard you describe yourself as basically a beat reporter. But you traveled quite a long way, from 700-word articles to a 100,000-word book, and you made it.
It's 101,000.
There you go. I was trying to do that, so it was almost got that right. So, well, what made you want to undertake this challenge of climbing this mountain, of trying to write a book?
Well, 5 or 7 years ago, my family, my wife and 4 children. I think the oldest at the time was 10, and the youngest was 3. We went out to New York on what was supposed to be kind of a sabbatical, but it was a science writing program at Columbia University, and part of that program was a book writing seminar. And I say I'm a beat reporter, but I'm not a beat reporter in the traditional sense as far as going down to the police station and looking at the blotter. My beat was the Great Lakes, and I was looking at big long issues. And pretty much every year, I do a big long story. And when I got out to Columbia, and I'm taking this class, and I'm serious when I say I was just trying to pass the class. I was really busy, and I didn't have an interest in writing a book necessarily. But part of this class was a proposal, and I looked at these chapters, or these projects that I had done, and they all kind of stacked up like chapters. So I put together that proposal, and I passed the class. Nobody in the history of this program has ever failed it, so I guess that's true, because people have been kicked out, but nobody's ever failed. And it just, being in New York just changes everything if you're into the arts or literature. It's such a small, insular community, and it turned out that this proposal made its way into the hands of an agent via a woman I met from the New York Times. And that agent happened to be the agent for the book writing seminar professor. He also happened to be a Milwaukee native. His name's Barney Carpfinger. So stars were kind of aligning as I was writing about carp too. And so Barney got a hold of the proposal, and it was lucky. And he just said, "This is going to be a good book. I'd like to represent you. If anything, you're shooting a little low as far as the way you're approaching the material. You're assuming too much knowledge. You're writing for Milwaukee, and you need to write for a national audience." So that's how. So then, it sounds like it just happened, but I saw Barney. I met with Barney the day after I graduated, and he said he'd get back to me. And he got back to me in August of that year. And that's when he said he'd like to represent me. And he said, there's a few things we need to tweak in the proposal. And that took a year and a half. Luckily, I had a job, and I wasn't waiting for Barney's emails, because they came few and far between. And I was all right with that, because I was, like I said earlier, I was busy. I was plenty busy with my job and with my family. I didn't really need to add a third thing. But I also knew if the opportunity presented itself, I'd be mad if I didn't take advantage of it. And so a year and a half of, it wasn't, we didn't even do that much work on it. He was just very busy. I was very low on his totem pole. And I remember, I think it was like a Friday, he sent me, here's a few tweaks. If you agree with them, implement them, send them back to me. And I remember he wrote, "This baby is ready to go." I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll talk to you in a couple of years. And I sent it back to him on a Friday, and on a Sunday night, that next Sunday night, like 2 days later, he said, this is what I've heard back from Matt at W.W. Norton, who was the editor that he thought would be the most appropriate person to shepherd this book into print. And he said, yes, let's talk Monday. And by Wednesday, we had a deal. And so, but then it was another 3 years of, before I finished the book. So it took me a long time.
One of the things that surprised me, learning about your background and your education and the book that's there is, you're someone who, and I've seen you do some things online speaking to much varied audiences. You speak today with such understanding and authority on this topic, but I was surprised to learn that you don't actually have a science background. I mean, you've got a degree in history, right? If I understand. I'm wondering is your lack of formal education in science part of the reason that makes this such an approachable book? I mean, you almost had to approach this as a reporter, right? And talking to the layperson like me.
Yeah, I think so. If you get too close to the material, and I do sometimes just because I'm learning on the job, you lose your audience. And there's also something to be said for just the virtues of constraints. No matter what you're doing, when you hit a wall, you got to go around it somehow, or a barrier, or some steel slats, razor wire.
I believe I'm in the red chair, you're in the blue chair. We've got the cameras on.
Anyway, no, so you can kind of turn it to your advantage. I mean, or at least you can sell it when you're trying to convince somebody to publish a book, saying, I don't have the expertise, but I do have, in some cases, the confidence of people who have expertise, and I do have the time to make sure I get it right, and I have 15 years of experience in doing that. So, yeah, I think it's a more. I'm not the first person to write about invasive species in the Great Lakes, and I'm not going to be the last. I think this is the one book that's probably the most appealing for the lay audiences. So, yeah.
How do you talk about making those kinds of decisions, sorting through this material, and one of the things that struck me as I was reading this is the sheer magnitude of information that you had to cover to tell this story. I mean, did you enter this process sort of with particular themes in mind, or are you a blank slate? I mean, how do you decide which stories that you're going to tell?
I was joking about the 101,450. I don't know how many words it is, but it was in the contract. It was 100,000 words, and that was like. It's like standing over a cliff. It just gave me a vertigo almost. Like I can't. I don't know if I can do that. But I had a plan, and that plan was assembled in that book writing seminar. And I was standing on top a decade's worth of work. And all thanks and credit to the editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, George Stanley, a Green Bay native. He gave me carte blanche to use whatever I had written in the paper in whatever manner I wanted or needed to. So I basically, wanted to use the best stuff that I had, and I needed to get to 100,000 words. And through some negotiations with the editor out in New York, who's a Minnesota native, so he had some, appreciation for what I was writing about and some understanding. We kind of mapped it out. And actually, I've kind of repressed some of this, but there was. One of the chapters became 2 chapters, and I think that was Lake Erie. I don't know, it doesn't matter. But it wasn't all just reassembling, cutting and pasting. If it had been, it wouldn't have taken 3 years. But I would send him drafts, and he would send me drafts back, and they just kept thumping on my front step every couple of months. And they weren't prescriptions so much as just like more of this, less of that, or I want you to just tell me everything. The Black Swamp west of Lake Erie. I just made some passing reference to it. He's like, I'm really interested in that. Go down that rabbit hole. And so I did. And you know, I've seen some people comment that the book sort of reads somewhat like, you know, a bunch of newspaper stories. It's like, yeah, because it is, but it's not. I mean, it wouldn't be what it was without those newspaper stories. But you know, it was. I think, you know, there was some value adding going on there.
Sure. You know, I've heard you refer to the Great Lakes not just as the Great Lakes, but you use the term freshwater seas. What difference does it make in what difference does it make in using that kind of a language and how we interact with or how we view the lakes themselves?
I don't know. I mean, one of the things I wrestled with right off the bat when I'm trying to, now I'm writing for, you know, a national audience for somebody in Topeka or Baton Rouge. And, although I wouldn't presume to think anybody in Topeka or Baton Rouge has actually read this book. They were on my mind. And I was, you know, one of the things I wrestled with, which I think lots of people wrestle with, is just the word lake. It just really doesn't do justice to what, you know, even coming up along Green Bay, you look out and that's just a little piece of Lake Michigan, and that's not just a lake. So yeah, I think, you know, I can go a little off the trail here, but I did a piece, Comedy Central did a piece to me on this book, and this guy was talking about why don't the Great Lakes get any respect, and he said, you know, like, if you're a sailor on the ocean, you're lost at sea. If you drown on a lake, you're just a drunk loser. I was like, that's kind of inappropriate, but it does kind of get at the idea that, you know, these things have a majesty that I don't think people who have never stood on their shores can appreciate. And so freshwater seas was a way to kind of get at that.
I think I saw that on Comedy Central, right? It was, and I thought either he's the greatest straight man in the world, or he has absolutely no sense of humor. He was straight face throughout that entire conversation. So
I don't know what you're talking about.
You know, one of the interesting themes about the book that I took from it was it really wasn't about water. I was struck by how we as humans, with our limited life expectancy, how we perceive time. You know, when I first experienced something in my childhood, I conclude that that's how it's always been, and really that's how it always should be. So if I caught salmon in the lake when I was a kid, obviously the salmon had always been there, and if anybody or anything wants to change that, then I have a problem with it. I wonder how many of the challenges that we're facing now or faced over the last several decades come from our lack of respect of the fact that this is a living system that's been here far longer than any of us have been here.
Yeah, and it's a dynamic system too. You know, it's been changing quite a bit, even before we came into the picture, and we've changed it dramatically. And I think everybody wants the lake of their youth, and maybe not the river of their youth. But, you know,
there's great fireworks outside.
But yeah, you know, and that's something that's important to, I think, to think about. You know, we're never going to get back what we lost, just like we're never going to get the hardwood forests that are now growing corn for, you know, ethanol and whatnot. But that's an aside. They were dynamic before, you know, we came into the picture. And I was just thinking about this the other night when I was talking to a guy about these pipelines up in the Straits of Mackinac. They carry some 23 million barrels of oil, gallons of oil a day across, you know, 4 miles of Great Lakes. And that was not always Great Lakes. That was a river between Michigan and Huron, which, you know, isn't too hard to comprehend. Michigan was higher and it would drop down, but there was a riverbank. And you think, yeah, but that was way back when. There's still tree stumps down there from when that was a river. It was only like 8,000 years ago. There's people who walked along that riverbank. And, you know, 8,000 years is not a very long period of time. So, yeah, I mean, we have to have an appreciation that things are changing, but we also have to have a sense of, I think, a greater sense, and I think it's much farther down the road now than we were in the 1960s and early 1970s of stewardship and of, you know, things are going to, talk specifically about invasive species. We're gonna get stuff, it's unavoidable, but that doesn't mean that you don't do what you can to stop it or slow it down. It's like taking care of yourself, you know. You could eat corned beef every night, you know, because you're gonna die, but you probably shouldn't. And so,
I'm not sure I quite get the analogy, but okay.
I guess the analogy is, it is human health. It's like, why, you know, I'm gonna die, why take care of myself? Well, the lakes are gonna get, you know, they're gonna get Asian carp, they're gonna get, let's just, who cares? Well, there's reasons to care, and it's because, you know, quality of life, whether it's for your own body or for it's for the lakes that you live along. So, you know, but I do think it's important to realize that they're gonna change, and that we're never gonna go backwards, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to do more.
You know, really the book is a story of two kinds of pollution, it seems like. You know, the first pollution is the pollution in the traditional sense, the industrial waste. But you've said that the most potent form of pollution out there is DNA. And elaborate a little bit on what do you mean by that in terms of DNA?
Well, what I was trying to get at, and it's been a lot of the, you know, what I've worked at the Journal Sentinel is I sat with my editor George Stanley, and you know, we talked about what are the big issues, and we concluded ballast water and invasive species, because I don't know what the number is right now, but I think there's 190 non-native, and there's a distinction between non-native and invasive. Invasive is a fuzzy term. It's basically you get to pick it, what you don't like. But you know, salmon are technically as much of an invader as Asian carp would be if they came in, because they're not native to the lakes. But so why is that important? Well, because you know, it depends on the species, and it depends on how they, you know, end up working together. But you look at what zebra and quagga mussels have done to the lake, and it's not just clearing up the water, and it's not just starving the whitefish. They've, you know, they're a critical factor in botulism outbreaks over in Sleeping Bear Dunes. And I guess a quick lesson on how the theory goes. You know, they've cleared up the water to such an extent that all this seaweed cladophora is growing on the lake bed, and that dies, and it burns up the oxygen, and it creates this anoxic environment for botulism bacterium to thrive. And then the mussels end up sucking that up, and then another invasive species around goby comes along, eats a poisoned mussel, floats to the surface, and then gets eaten by, you know, all manner of birds, and they've had tens of thousands of birds dying over there from botulism. So that's you know, it's a horrible, deadly toxin, and as dangerous as anything that comes out of a pipe or a smokestack. And this breeding notion, what I'm trying to get at is, you know, as the Clean Water Act showed, we can get a handle on these traditional industrial pollutants with technology and just with you know, a heightened consciousness or a heightened awareness of our responsibilities and our abilities. But you can't, you know, with this biological pollution, you can't cap it. You know, it doesn't decay or disperse; it breeds. And so that's what I was getting at. And you know, there's been some, like when Toledo lost their drinking water, mussels were a big part of that. And I don't know if you're familiar, but in 2014, there was a toxic plume of algae that went into the drinking water intake in Toledo at the end of July. And you know, in a matter of hours, 500,000 people had no drinking water, and you couldn't do a boil order because it would only concentrate the toxin. So the do not drink order went out at like 1 in the morning, and by 8, stores an hour away were out of bottled water, and the National Guard had to be called to bring in like baby formula and, you know, bottled water for a panicked public. And so how are mussels involved in this? Well, they don't have a brain, but they're smart enough not to eat toxic algae called microcystis. And so you can see videos of this on YouTube where a mussel is basically filtering the water, sucking all the flecks out of it and eating it. But when a certain type of fleck comes in, it spits it back out, and that's microcystis. And so they're basically selecting. So when you had an algae outbreak on Lake Erie in the 60s or 70s, it was a whole assemblage of species. Now it's much more likely to be this very, very dangerous, nasty microcystis. And so that there's a pollution problem again. You know, it's not just a matter of the name of the species that are in the lake or the type of the fish. It's the, you know, not just the ecological integrity either. It's the health of the lake, and it's the health of the people who live along it.
One of the things that struck me when you were saying about it's also a story of evolution, right? It's the adaptation. I mean, what do you feel like in terms of the future of the lakes? I mean, you mentioned that there's a reason for optimism, and you point to Lake Huron. So
yeah, I mean, I think if we can just slow down the pace of these, and we have slowed it down, of these invasions, which are mostly coming, you know, from the overseas ships dumping their ballast water in the lakes. They've done a lot to reduce the likelihood of dropping organisms, but they haven't done enough, and they're still finding new stuff. So, I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
oh, that's okay.
No.
I was talking about evolution and Lake
Oh
Huron.
yeah. So thank you. So yeah, if we can slow down the pace of these invasions, nature's going to find a new balance. It always does, and it's just been swinging so far out of whack. And what's happening on Lake Huron and to a significant degree on Lake Michigan is we're reaching a new balance where, you know, these gobies I mentioned earlier are eating mussels and getting poisoned over Sleeping Bear Dunes. Well, they're eating them over here, and they're not getting poisoned. They're actually becoming a food source for native lake trout, native walleye, and even whitefish, which, you know, didn't evolve to eat fish, but now they are because, you know, they're starving otherwise. And whitefish are also eating quagga mussels. So it's kind of neat to see like these native species making a comeback. What's interesting, and you know, bad news for like the commercial fishing or the recreational charter fishing industry, is that the salmon aren't going after gobies, and so the salmon are, I mean, it depends on the year, it depends on who you talk to, but they're gone on Lake Huron. And Lake Huron and Lake Michigan really are the same lake. I mean, the Straits of Mackinac connects them. They're two lobes of one big lake, which would be the biggest lake by surface area in the world if they were recognized as such. And I don't know why they're not. I should look into that. Probably because the United States wants its own Great Lake. I'm just guessing that. But no, it's neat to see this top of the food chain stitching itself back together. The bottom of the food chain looks more like the Caspian Sea, maybe, but we've got, you know, whitefish in the restaurants on Friday nights, and it's coming from our lake. So that's, and the whitefish are doing really well, and so are the lake trout.
One of the things that you see and read throughout the book is a series of stories of unintended consequences, right? Mm-hmm. And good, well-meaning people making good decisions that go awry. But I wondered though, how many of these things, I mean, in your opinion, are reasonable people making reasonable choices that any one of us would have made given the same situation, and it not aware of how it was going to create a problem, or is this in some cases an actual situation where it's just a bad decision? You know, it's not a reasonable one.
I don't think there's a lot of malfeasance going on. I mean, they all, and I tried to reflect this in the book, that these decisions made a lot of sense for the time, like the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. You know, that, I said ship. No, I say that everywhere.
Well, they're your kids out there.
Yeah, they're okay with saying ship. No, I mean, that was kind of an elegant solution to a public health crisis at the time. Let's flush Lake Michigan, you know, through the subcontinental divide into the Mississippi River and send Chicago's waste down to the Gulf of Mexico. And, you know, it saved a lot of lives and allowed Chicago to blossom, bloom, mushroom, whatever you want to call it, in a way that never would have otherwise. But now, in the 21st century, is that the best use of that water? Or should it be, you know, in its native watershed basin? And, you know, it cost a lot of money to re-engineer that river, but then you'd also solve some other problems, like, you know, the potential for invasive species to swim up the Sanitary and Ship Canal and to swim down. So, but my point is it looks dumb today. It doesn't look dumb, it looks arrogant and just almost not ham-handed or fisted, but it just seems kind of like a very blunt answer to a complicated problem. But it was a perfect answer for the time. I don't know if it's the perfect answer today. Where we go with that, I have no idea.
Using a broadsword when a scalpel would have...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we didn't have scalpels then, or we didn't have the metaphor of that, whatever we're talking about then, and that we do now. I mean, we do have technologies that can keep cargo flowing, sewage moving in the right direction, and beaches open, and, yeah.
One of the folks out here in the audience was curious about, to get those information, to find out. I mean, obviously, you had talked to a tremendous number of people to figure out what was going on, and you were able to assess a lot of them and being reasonable, people making reasonable decisions. How difficult was it to get people to be honest with you and open up with you, particularly when some of the decisions they made might, in retrospect, have turned to be problematic?
Well, a lot of the problems are historical, so I'm not talking to the people who made the decision to build the Seaway or the Chicago Canal.
There was some Great Lakes research, I can't remember where it was, but I saw an interview he had done where there was a report and some fella had admitted that he'd never even read the report.
Oh, yeah. Collister Johnson Jr. Yeah, that was really interesting, and it was really arrogant. I thought they did a study on, okay, we can't solve this ballast water problem right now with the technologies we have. What would it cost if we just didn't let these overseas ships in? And there's a big distinction between those big boats tied up here getting fixed for the winter and these salties that come and go. The salties, the ones that bring the invasive species, only account for about 5% of the cargo moved on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway system. And so this analysis was done by a couple of, as near as I could tell, very neutral guys over in Michigan. One was retired with the state and one was at Grand Valley State University. And they were logistical professors or logistic people. And they basically looked at, okay, if we didn't have these boats, how would we get, it's basically steel coming in and grain going out. That's almost all the traffic. And they said, okay, what if we, put it on a Mississippi River barge, or what if we put it on train, or what if we put it on trucks? And they looked at all these different options. And the conclusion they came to was that we're saving about $55 million a year annually. And this was when there were 12 million tons of cargo moving on salties. It's down to about 5 million. This was done in 2005 or 2007. Anyway, they said it was about 55 million, and it was peer-reviewed in a very public fashion down at the Shedd Aquarium. They brought in these people from around the country to hammer these scientists and these researchers on how they reached their conclusions. And their conclusion was, if anything, you were too kind in that number. It's smaller than that. So that's an important number to know, and I think it's frightening for the shipping industry, but I think it's also a motivator for them to know that, like, look, we can live without you. You can't live without our lakes, and they are our lakes. And so the Collister Johnson Jr. Was not interested in reading this document, and I asked him why, and he just said it's all theoretical, academic junk.
So
yeah.
what is the? Now that's a fellow who's long since retired, right?
Yeah.
So what's stopping us politically, legally, or is it public sentiment? Why aren't we making these changes to deal with this pollution that is invasive species?
Because I don't think things have gotten bad enough. I mean, it's kind of back to the corned beef, but I mean, it's like you can think, how could things get like the apocryphal story of the patent office, like in the 1900s. They say that they talked about shutting it down because there's nothing left to invent. We've got everything. I can't even think of what else we could need. And in a way, you could say that that's similar to our approach to invasive species. We kind of think, even the Army Corps, when they were looking at expanding the Seaway, they said, look, the lakes have suffered mightily from unwanted invasions, but we think they've seen the worst of it. And that was before quagga mussels, which are literally 10 times worse than zebra mussels, became an issue at all. So, things can always get worse. And it's not, a lot of attention, and I've been part of this, has been placed on these Asian carp that have the potential to invade the lakes. And there's some biologists who say that it's undue attention, though there's a threat, it pales in comparison to some other threats. And I agree to a degree. I don't think we're going to have Asian carp jumping in the lake during our lifetimes. And I don't think that there's enough plankton out there for them to thrive in the manner that they do in the Mississippi River Basin because of the mussels. The mussels are basically, they eat the same thing as these carp, and they kind of beat them to the punch. But they could do very well in Green Bay and actually all the bays and harbors, which happen to be where people recreate. So, you know, there's a real threat there to the future of, say, jet skiing or water skiing, any kind of recreational boating. So, yeah, I'm tired. Remind me where I'm going.
You were about to tell us what we can be doing or what we should be doing as a nation and what we can be doing as individuals to sort of...
Okay. So my point with the carp was that they do serve a purpose, and that is we have 190 maybe non-native species, and now we care about 191 or 192. The carp are charismatic megafauna or whatever, you know, they grab people's attention, and that's good, but you know, people should be worried about other stuff, much smaller stuff. It's kind of like, you know, you hear about grizzly bears and sharks and, you know, the predators that they are and the killing that they do, but the real killing goes down in the microbial level, and then these are threats that the Great Lakes still face with ballast water. I mean, who knows what kind of virus could be brought in? Cholera has been transported in ballast water. So there's some real threats. And so now I'm picking up steam, I remember what you asked. Where's the political will to shut the door to these new invasions? And unfortunately, I think it's going to take something bad. And, you know, maybe we get lucky and it doesn't happen in our lifetime. But I don't know. I mean, and I also know that the costs are so dispersed throughout the 30, 40 million people who live inside the Great Lakes Basin, and the benefits to the shipping industry are so concentrated in you know, these families. And in Canada, it is just a matter of families practically. One of them, Paul Martin's family, former prime minister. Powerful people. They make a lot of money running these ships, and they're very well connected, and they make a good argument that, you know, they're integral to the economy of all North America, and I think there's an argument that they're not so important that they should be able to, you know, continue to pollute the lakes in the way that they have.
So what can we do? What can we do on a local level here in Door County as citizens and as people who care?
Well, there's this book.
You talked about the Cuyahoga River being that spark.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, no, and exactly. And I was actually thinking about the Cuyahoga when you asked that question. And, you know, people were asking, what's it going to take to stop these algae outbreaks on Lake Erie? And I was over there the week that they lost the water. I left on Friday morning and they lost it on Saturday morning at 2 a.m. And, you know, people said at the time, it may take Toledo losing their drinking water. And boom, it happened. And nothing really much has happened in terms of throttling those algae outbreaks. So yeah, sparks. You know, you need sparks, and hopefully they're not disasters. But you do need, and it's really interesting to think about our reaction to that Cuyahoga River fire in June of 1969. You know, that was what's notable about that, as I wrote in the book, is it's the last time the river burned. It was burning all the time, and rivers were burning not just in the Great Lakes but all across the country because we just let industry run roughshod over the public waters. They treated them literally as liquid dumps, and you know, that was, you can blame industry, but you got to blame the public too, because industry stopped once we demanded that it stopped. And you know, we still have, you know, all the products that, well, a lot of them are foreign sourced now, but that's not necessarily because of these regulations that are the Clean Water Act. But we got the Clean Water Act out of it, and you know, hopefully we'll get greater protections for the lake going forward. But it's going to take an informed public, and that was kind of a goal of the book, to give people kind of a sense of Great Lakes literacy. Because, you know, it's amazing. When I moved back here in 2002 and I started doing the reporting, for the newspaper, just what I didn't know. I didn't really, I mean, I had a sense that salmon weren't native to the system, but I didn't know the story of how, they were, it's entirely, for a long time, it was like a put and take fishery. So, yeah, and I had an editor at the paper, when he was a very good editor, but we were having a real rough time with each other in one section of one story, and it finally became clear the reason why he just wasn't understanding what I thought was so obvious was because in his mind Niagara Falls flowed in from the ocean instead of out. And but I'm laughing, but there's a ton of things, just very basic things that I didn't know going into this. And I would just like to say, I don't know if anybody here knew him, but Paul Peters with the DNR, who was based up here in Sturgeon Bay for years and years, passed away a couple of years ago. He was so generous with his time. He just sat down and he basically walked me through Great Lakes ecology or fisheries biology 101. And there were a lot of people like that that were willing to share their time. And it's neat because a lot of times the scientists don't want to talk to the public. They just want to do their work and let the chips fall. And I think it's important to get this information out. And so you can start with a book.
Well, it's a great start. One of the things I was curious about is we who live on the Great Lakes have a real appreciation for the sheer magnitude, the scale of the Great Lakes. But I don't think that's always appreciated or even recognized by a huge percentage of our country, a majority of this country who lives far away and has no concept of what these lakes are. I mean, as you've been traveling around and telling these stories, I mean, how is your book being received in areas that aren't immediately adjacent to one of the lakes?
I think it's being received pretty well. I haven't done a lot of talks outside of the Great Lakes Basin, Great Lakes states, but I will say, this is funny, people's perceptions of the lake or their misperceptions. This apparently happened. They did American Idol at the Milwaukee Art Museum, which is right on Lake Michigan, and I think it was Jennifer Lopez was a judge. And, somebody must not have told her in the helicopter ride over from Mitchell International that she was in Wisconsin because she was sitting there and she said, this is just such a beautiful facility and to have the ocean behind us. Or, I have this in the book, I don't know why Keith Richards was thinking about Lake Superior, but there was an article in Forbes magazine, and they were trying to get at the magnitude of Rolling Stones Inc., just like, how big these guys are. And he used the analogy, it's like you go down to the surface, or you go down to Lake Michigan, and you look across this massive expanse of water, and you think, oh my God. And then he says, and then you think, that's just the top. But I think nationally it does have relevance, not just because of where we're heading into a century where water, reliability is going to become shakier and shakier, and so much of it is here, but also because these invasions are normally, the Great Lakes are the beachhead, and then these things move inland, and in the case of mussels, they move over the Continental Divide, and they're making, a mess or a nuisance of themselves in the Colorado River Basin, and if they get into the Columbia River Basin and all those hydro plants, they're saying it's like going to be more than $1 billion a year just to keep things humming out there. So it is a national issue, and I do try to write it as a story where it has its own intrinsic value as a story, and I can see, I get a glimpse from Amazon, every week they'll tell you it's like a Nielsen's, they do a book, like the bookstores, they'll show you at certain bookstores, how many are selling. It comes out like on Thursdays at like 2:01. No, I just check once in a while. But it's interesting to see that there, it is selling, out on the coasts. So.
So people are paying attention. Maybe this becomes the spark we need. So.
Yeah.
One of the, probably all the questions that have been hanging up here, this is perhaps the most important, which is, do you remember when Laura and Nikki Cafton babysat you?
No, but I think I remember, is her brother Joe? And I think he played in some asphalt. No, he walked across from asphalt.
Well, you kept setting off that sulfur is what the problem is.
Yeah, right.
You were starting these sulfur fumes. So, we've got to wrap this up here pretty quickly. We've got, I know a number of folks who love to be visiting with you personally and signing. But before we end, there's one other question that I wanted to take a couple minutes with. There's a little throwaway line in the book that refers to the Papal Navy. And I've read that you didn't know until you did your research for the book that at one time the Pope actually had a navy. And you said that those little discoveries, right, these little, I think you called them running down the rabbit hole,
yeah,
were some of the most enjoyable things about writing the book. So I'm curious, what are some of the most interesting things or stories that you discovered that you didn't find place to put into the book?
You know, I can't really answer that because I don't.
Was it the next book? Is that what?
Well, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about the rabbit holes I'm in right now. One has to do with a biplane that they used as a trainer in World War II. I'm writing a book about phosphorus, and in New Zealand they spread phosphorus everywhere to grow the grass to feed the lambs that I like when I'm not eating corned beef. Anyway, it's a fascinating plane, and they actually were using it in experiments there during right after Dunkirk. They were afraid the Germans were going to invade, so they equipped these biplanes with scythes, and they were called paraslashers, and they were practicing like flying them through paratrooper clusters, German paratroop and so I spent. You're asking me what's interesting. It wasn't in this book, but it probably won't be in the next book. But these are the things that you just go down. And I would like to have some stories, and there are, but nothing is jumping out right now. I will say, just for anybody, I think it costs $99 a year. It's called newspapers.com, and it's a searchable database of hundreds of newspapers going back to the 1830s. And I was doing some research, I think it was on lampricide in the 50s, the poison that they used to kill sea lampreys. And I ended up following this, this murderer in London got loose, and the American papers were covering it. And for 4 days, they had him in a neighborhood in London. They finally found him in a closet. But I spent, this isn't related to the Great Lakes, but yes. They found him in a closet. And I was just thinking, this is an interesting job to be able to just kind of dig into this stuff and then see wherever it goes. Usually it stays related to the Great Lakes. But this newspapers.com thing is really, the Press Gazette's part of it. You can just type in and, pull up your grandpa and what he was doing in 1930. It's pretty cool.
So these sort of rabbit hole stories were the things, Annie, that you made sure to mark out of the final draft, I believe, more than anything else. So. Well, I just want to say thank you again for coming out here. We really appreciate it. We're here to talk about celebrating water, and it's important to our community. And in many ways, this year-long series of activities was inspired very much so by your book and by your family and your mom. And so we're honored to be a part of it, and we're very happy you're here. So thank you. Let's all give them a round of applause. Thank you.